You're watching Environmental Toxins and Your Health by Dr. Alyssa Gaul on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Alleviate series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Environmental Toxins and Your Health. My name is Dr. Alyssa Gaul, and I'll be your host and guide this evening about all things toxic. And alleviate, of course, is the first step in the whole life medicine approach to patient guidance at Resonance Wellness. And when we're talking about environmental toxins, we're most definitely talking about how they might be one of the root causes of ill health. We're also talking about the possibility of strengthening detoxification in a person using the clean slate process. And often this requires us to put in missing ingredients for detoxification because it requires specific nutrient cofactors. We also need to consider the different types of toxins and how best to eliminate them, and that often requires a problem-specific program. So with those thoughts in mind, let's dive into this very broad topic. First of all, let's just take a look at where environmental toxins are really found. And environmental toxins is a pretty broad term, but it's used to describe toxins in the air, water, or food supply that are known or suspected to cause diseases and conditions. There are currently 80,000 chemicals approximately used in North America, contributing to a large increase in the amount of environmental toxins that one is going to be exposed to, on top of naturally occurring toxins and exposures that can contribute to poor health. A great deal of research has been performed that shows that people can suffer tremendously from an accumulation of toxins, either by excessive exposure or a combination of susceptibility and an exposure that might not otherwise be noticed in a non-susceptible person. So sometimes it actually is about what your personal predilections are. We can also consider the contribution of both artificial and natural electromagnetic fields that surround us with frequency information that's not compatible with normal biological function. Although we're not going to have a chance to talk about this in detail today, the impact of a combination of electromagnetic fields and toxins appears to potentiate both also in a susceptible person. We're all familiar with the potential of toxic exposures to create acute poisoning, I think. But what's often unclear is how exposures can build up to create really significant contributions to symptoms and even to actually create a disease state in almost any body system. Many of the toxins that we're going to talk about today are endocrine disruptors. The endocrine system is a collection of glands that produce hormones that regulate all sorts of functions: metabolism, growth and development, tissue function, sexual function and reproduction, sleep, mood, amongst other things. And an endocrine disruptor can create issues in all of these areas by either increasing or decreasing the production of certain hormones, or imitating hormones, turning one hormone into another, interfering with hormone signaling within your body, signaling cells to die prematurely, competing with essential nutrients, binding to essential hormones, or accumulating in organs that produce hormones. And according to the Environmental Working Group, there's really no end to the tricks that endocrine disruptors can play on our bodies. And the list of diseases caused by endocrine disruptors is continually growing. Endocrine disruptors have been linked to attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, early puberty, reproductive disorders, and childhood and adult cancers. So, if you're looking at it from cancers, tumors, to congenital disabilities and developmental disorders, these kind of disrupting toxins can impact any system. And knowing that hormones are responsible for the control of so many essential biological functions, it's really crucial to limit exposure to endocrine disrupting toxins. And our first two toxins we're going to talk about tonight are known as some of the most impactful on the endocrine system. First toxin on our list is BPA. Most people have heard of this compound. It's bisphenol A or BPA. And BPA is an industrial chemical. It's been used to make plastics and resins since the 1960s. So BPA is used in plastics to make them more pliable. And as a result, historically, BPA containing polycarbonate plastics are often used in containers to store food and beverages like water bottles, like we're picturing here. And according to the Center for Disease Control, people are commonly exposed to low levels of BPA when they consume food or water that's been stored in containers made with this chemical. BPA is actually structurally similar to estrogen. And exposures to BPA can therefore affect any type of process that estrogen is involved in. And so when you have something that's structurally similar to estrogen, what that means is that often it can actually interact with your own internal estrogen receptors and have an impact on it in a way that's not exactly the normal impact. Your own internal estrogens, as an example, vary in binding capacity by almost 200-fold. So you have three main kinds of estrogen as an example, and one of them is very, very strongly binding. It creates really strong estrogenic stimulation. One is very weakly binding and actually can decrease estrogenic stimulation. But the interesting thing about some of these compounds that are structurally similar, like BPA to estrogens, we can't always predict how they're going to interact with a receptor and what set of receptors they're going to act on and in which tissue compartment they're going to act. And so there's a very wide variety of potential impacts of that. So as a consequence, you know, the Environmental Working Group has reported that BPA has been linked to everything from breast and other cancers to reproductive problems, obesity, early puberty, heart disease. And according to government tests in the United States, 93% of Americans have BPA measurably present in their bodies. And that's going to be quite similar for Canadians in general. We do have some differences between countries in what we allow and don't allow. However, there are more consistencies than not. So if you take this one toxin as an example, like those people with the highest levels of BPA in urine tests are literally twice as likely to suffer from coronary heart disease than those people with not very big concentrations. There was one study where there were about 1,400 adults tested, and what they found that there was a strong association between increased BPA and not only this likelihood of heart disease, but also diabetes and abnormal liver function. There's over 150 studies that have correlated BPA with the risk for breast cancer, and women who are exposed have an 83% increased risk of miscarriage. So, of course, fertility problems in both females and males have been linked to the use of BPA. Now, avoiding BPA can be challenging because it's so prevalent. But, you know, there are some tips that we can use to minimize exposure. For example, you can change your habits where you can and buy or store foods in glass or stainless steel, or just avoid packaging altogether when possible. You can look for BPA-free labels on foods and packaging. This does technically reduce your exposure to BPA, but be forewarned that a BPA-free plastic may still have other toxins associated with it. In fact, over 90% of over 500 plastic products that are marketed as BPA-free, in some cases, had greater estrogenic activity than the BPA-containing plastics. You know, and this is unfortunately kind of pathognomonic of our approach to incorporating chemicals into our lives. It's not very well planned, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we kind of go along. But again, sometimes we just figure out something to avoid, and then the avoidance strategy is sometimes worse off. Now, you want to avoid plastics marked with a PC or polycarbonate. This is often recycling label number 7. So those are those little triangles on the bottom of plastics. that have the numbers in the middle of them. So recycling label 7, some marked number 3 may also have BPA in them. And where you can, really avoid heating foods in plastic containers of any type, but in particular, if there's a specific kind of toxin in this plastic number 7 has the BPA, heat it really increases the release of plasticizer toxins. And I think microwaving is probably worse than most ways of heating, like we're just having hot food in it. You really want to cool food down before storing it in that kind of plastic as well. And don't leave water bottles like this in the sun. And don't put them in the dishwasher or use really harsh detergents on them, because damaging plastic surfaces tends to release plasticizers. There have been a number of warnings in the past about BPA in toys. And at this point, most known BPA has been pulled from toys in Canada. But again, you have to choose other kinds of plastics. And ideally, if you can choose non-plastic toys, that'd be great. But wow, try and do that. Sometimes that can be difficult. Now, toxin number 2, that's a fairly major one, are the phthalates. That's kind of a silent P. Phthalates. These are a group of chemicals that are used to make vinyl plastics. So vinyl plastics need to be flexible, and this particular group of compounds, kind of similar to BPA, are used to make vinyl plastics flexible and harder to break, so not the polycarbonates. So these are also found a great deal in products that are designed to hold scent. So things like scented shampoos and soaps and moisturizers and aftershaves, a lot of the time the phthalate content in them actually increases the staying power of both a natural or an artificial scent. Now, there's lots of categories of things that will have this kind of plastic in them. Those vinyl raincoats and rain boots, shower curtains. People probably can recall at some point in their life smelling a vinyl shower curtain. PVC water pipes and vinyl flooring and mini blinds, a lot of the time, are made out of those compounds. There's phthalates in household cleaners and glues and paint. And like we said, the soft plastic toys. School supplies often have them, like things like scribblers that have the plastic cover on them. Steering wheels often have phthalates, vinyl seating, and plastic consoles, like in cars. It's responsible for the new car smell everybody loves. It is actually probably quite toxic. Enterically coated drugs often have phthalates, so they're meant to be a bit resistant and get past certain parts of the digestive tract. Fast food wrappers often will have a non-stick coating that has phthalates on it. Nail polish and hairspray, and lubricating oils. There's a lot of things that have phthalates in them. And usually, why phthalates are so important is that our bodies have a signaling system to program cells to die as part of normal health. That's just normal. You don't perpetually, increase the number of cells. You would be ginormous, like a plant. But you're not a plant, and some of your cells have to die as part of normal health. And studies have shown that the phthalates can trigger death-inducing signaling. And so they die earlier than they should. And that, of course, can damage tissues and not allow tissues to repair properly. Phthalates phthalates is a big group of chemicals. So there are hormone-disrupting chemicals amongst the phthalates that interfere with the production of testosterone. So, of course, that's necessary for proper development and function of male reproductive organs. And if you interfere with testosterone activity, especially early in life, you can have irreversible effects on male reproduction. And fetal exposure in male animals has been associated with infertility, decreased sperm count, undescended testicles, malformations of the penis and the urethra. And if you combine phthalates, even at low levels, the phthalates can often act together to cause similar harm as seen with exposure to just one phthalate at higher level. So obviously, that doesn't sound very good for for development. They've also been linked with obesity and reduced female fertility, preterm birth and low birth weight, a worsening of allergy and asthma symptoms, and altered toddler behavior. There are phthalates that have been linked to birth defects, and it's often not the dose, but the timing and duration of exposure to those types of compounds during critical windows of development that makes them so harmful. Um, the total amount of phthalate contained in a toy product can vary from 10 to 50% of that toy, of the plastic in that toy, depending on the degree of softness required. That was from the Australian Consumer Commission. They published that in 2011. And traditional toxicity testing is really not adequate to determine the chemical safety of these compounds, which can obviously act at levels as tiny as 1/10 of a trillionth of a gram. So that, to put that into context, that's like if you were looking at 1 second in like 3,169 centuries, or one drop of gin in a train of tank cars full of tonic that's 100 kilometers long. I mean, this is how little is required to actually create problems in some biological systems. We completely underestimate the power sometimes of these compounds. Now, to reduce exposure to phthalates, you can use similar strategies as you would for avoiding BPA. So you're going to minimize the use of plastic containers and wraps. So this is plastic number 3, is the phthalate containing kind, the vinyl kind. You can choose fragrance-free home and personal products, or at least check them to see how they're scented. It doesn't always say like phthalate on it, but you can actually run your products through the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep database to see how they rank for safety if they're the things that are personal products to you. That's ewg.org. Actually, I'm just going to write that on here for you because I didn't write that. This is a great website that I've used for many, many years to advise patients on what kind of product selection, because I don't know everything about every single product, but the working group actually has a very good extensive database for lots of different products. You can also avoid toys made before 2009. We didn't actually ban some of these compounds until 2009 in Canada. Try and consider healthier home building products. There are a lot of products. We're going to talk about some of these as we go along because, of course, phthalates aren't the only things that are being found in building products. Buy Canadian-made furniture, and then when you get that furniture, expose it to the sun. Take like those foam furnitures and bedding and put them outside. Sunlight will actually help kind of gas them off. And then increase the ventilation in your home. Use good filters and air cleaners, especially if you can really smell something. And get a good vacuum with a HEPA filter so that if these compounds end up in the dust in your home, you can clean them up and not just sit in them. Now, another big category that we talk about in terms of environmental toxicity are the heavy metals. And trace amount of heavy metals naturally exist in our bodies, and we're naturally exposed to metals with forest fires, burning, volcanic activity, obviously, a different kind of burning, and the weathering of the Earth's crust. But increased exposure can really pose significant health threats. And I think this has been recognized throughout history. We have those expressions like mad as a hatter or crazy as a painter. I'm sure you've heard those hopefully before, unless you've been a hatter or a painter. So a number of metals can have an impact on your health. And when we test in clinic for this, we actually test a wider range of metals than we're going to talk about today, including arsenic and cadmium and aluminum. But lead and mercury are really the top two metal exposures. I think the guesstimate is 2.5 billion homes from before the 1970s on this planet have like the 50% lead content paint in them. That means like half the paint is lead. It's like it's not safe to remove yourself at all. Lead does not break down over time. It is bound to the red blood cell inside your body. So when it gets inside of you, it's easily distributed throughout your tissues. It's often high in household dust, and it can be high in drinking water, depending on where you're getting your drinking water from or how it's being stored. It's found in lipstick. It's found in that black coal eyeliner. Lots of people who do hobbies where you use solder or fishing weights, like in fishing, ammunition, those things are all lead. Lead crystal is 25% lead, although it often has to be new or damaged by something to expose you to the lead. Like you don't, generally speaking, heat things in lead crystal, and you shouldn't do that. Lead's even found in candle wicks in Canada. We haven't banned it. So I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but the odd time you'll get a wick, and on this inside of it, there'll be a thread of lead. And what that does, it actually improves the candle burning because it makes the wick more resistant to burning down to the nub. And it's like Viagra for candle burning. But it's basically aerosolizing lead into your environment. On top of, if it's a cheap candle, because a lot of the time it's the cheaper candles that use this, and a lot of the time they're artificially centered and filled with phthalates. So lead can contribute to a lot of different conditions. Basically, at low concentrations, it can increase your cancer risk and your cardiovascular risk. It can contribute to hypertension and impaired IQ, impaired vitamin D metabolism. And as you get into higher concentrations, it can create male infertility, kidney damage, fatigue and headache, red blood cell problems where you actually become anemic, tremor, and lethargy and seizures. Lead can be stored in your body in bone, and it's often a source of toxicity and osteoporosis in postmenopausal women if people are mobilizing more bone out of their stores, like more minerals out of their stores. Because of those processes, you'll actually release the stored lead out of the bone. Now, the second major heavy metal is mercury, and of course that also has a long history of use and exposure in human beings. It's used as a medicine to induce vomiting. It's been in calomel. I don't know if you remember seeing that. That's some mercury-containing teething powder that used to be used. It was used to treat worms. Lots of people used to use mercurochrome on wounds. And it just kind of faded from use, actually, as opposed to being banned. Commercially, it's used in gold mining because mercury actually easily grabs onto gold and dissolves it. And then you can take the gold-laced mercury and do some processes to it that actually separate the gold and the mercury from each other, reuse the mercury. So it's used in fungicides on grains and bananas. It's in cosmetics, it's in batteries, it's in switches, it's in thermometers, fluorescent light bulbs, especially the new ones, dental amalgams, drugs like vaccines and diuretics. We use it in refining natural gas. We use it in coal-powered power stations. And I don't know if you realize this, but there's 18 coal-fired power plants in this province. Those plants combined produce over half of Alberta's electricity. And of course, they're trying to shut down the coal-fired power plants, but they're going to be phasing them out probably until the middle of this century. There's two main forms of mercury. Sometimes people ask me about this. There's organic and inorganic, and the inorganic mercury is bound to like another atom, like sulfur or oxygen. So you get a salt, like a mercury salt. And organic mercury is bound to carbon. So when you look at inorganic mercury salts, those are often very absorbable by inhalation. So they create bronchitis and pneumonitis, and if you eat enough of that or you inhale enough of that, death. So if you inhale it, about 80% of the mercury is retained. But if you swallow it, maybe 10% will be retained. If you ate the element liquid mercury, only about 0.01% would be retained. But the inhalation really gets you. And so this is the problem with those light bulbs with the mercury in them. Not a good idea to break one of those and then inhale it, basically. So chronic long-term mercury exposure usually affects the central nervous system. So it starts as insomnia or forgetfulness, a loss of appetite, or a mild tremor, and then it progressively turns into persistent tremor, red palms, emotional lability, memory impairment, sometimes excessive sweating, and renal toxicity. Now, organic mercury, which is carbon, also often known as methyl mercury, is the kind you get from eating contaminated seafood. And it's very easily absorbed and enters the blood because it's literally bound to an organic element, carbon. And so you can see the mercury levels rise after eating something with mercury in it. Clinically, if you get enough of it inside of you, you can get problems with walking, or ataxia is what that's called. Intention tremors, that means when you go to reach for something, you shake. You can have fine tremors of your tongue or lips or outstretched hands. You can be hypersalivating. You can have cold but red hands and feet. Mood difficulties. There's lots of different signs and symptoms of this. I have only seen this really, really markedly in a toxic way a couple of times. One time I was treating a man for pain. It's probably about 15 years ago. And what I didn't realize is that he was virtually sopping in metals and solvents. It was just how he conducted his business. He was full of that sort of stuff. And when we actually did the neural therapy for pain, all of those compounds started to move because we improved the circulation so much with neural therapy. And he actually went into a hypersalivation response, like in front of my eyes. It was crazy. That's when it immediately became evident that that's probably where most of his pain was coming from. And I didn't know before this about how much solvents and mercury and metals he was actually exposed to. He hadn't discussed it with me. So, or it hadn't come up. But it was crazy. Now, pregnant women are obviously at very high risk from the toxic effects of mercury, since the metal's really known to concentrate in fetal brains, and it can really interfere with brain development. And the same is true in children, small children. So if you're going to try and reduce your exposures, like to reduce your exposure to lead, find out when your home was built. If yours was built before 1978, woodwork or other surfaces could be covered with lead paint. And call an expert if you want to remove lead paint. Don't try and do it yourself because, like I said, up to 50% of that could be lead. And to get it off or sand it off or whatever you're going to do with it, if you want to remove panels with it, then that could be easily aerosolized and you can inhale that. Don't wear your shoes into the house. I mean, I know a lot of Canadians don't really do this. This is more of an American thing. But tracking dirt often will have metal residues in it. And as we've mentioned before, you can use a vacuum with a HEPA filter in it to eliminate some of the load of that. A good water filter can reduce your exposure to lead in drinking water. It's a little bit less common here, but it's common in lots of different cities around North America. Evaluate your hobbies, consider how to do them more safely if you are soldering things all the time, and limit your known exposures in cosmetics and building materials. The same with mercury. It's better avoided than treated. With the organic mercury, you can minimize your consumption of big fish. That's a common source of methyl mercury. And make sure if you're taking a fish oil, you're having one that's made out of small fishes. So if you look at the bigger fish like tuna and halibut and lobster, mahi-mahi, sea bass, They're big enough that they should be limited in pregnancy and children. Like they can still have it on occasion, but not eat it regularly. And things like sharks, shark meat, swordfish, tilefish, king mackerels or marlins, bluefin tuna and big eye tuna, and orange roughy. I don't know if I say that right. I always say roughy. I've heard somebody call it rui. So if I've got that wrong, I apologize. You shouldn't really eat those kinds regularly. When a fish is really large and when it's carnivorous and it's high up on the food chain, it'll bioaccumulate those metals from all of those little fishes that it eats. And like I said, these particular compounds are so incredibly biopersistent that they just don't spontaneously leave, and they certainly don't spontaneously leave in an aquatic environment. Salmon Lara is pretty okay. It's one of those fishes that, generally speaking, doesn't have as high of a mercury load in it as some of these much larger fishes. And tests that have been usually there's a yearly test by the Environmental Working Group on fish to see what the average loads are. And salmon didn't make the high list. And I don't think it has for a couple of years at least. Also, like I said, be really super careful with the new types of light bulbs. And consider removing your amalgams. If you have amalgam fillings, those are not silver, those are mercury. And you should discuss with your dentist whether it might benefit you to remove them. There are dentists that do that very safely. They use very good ventilation, and they can repack your teeth with non-toxic materials. But you shouldn't just go to just anyone. You can remove amalgams. Lots of dentists feel that they're not a big deal, but honestly, there are films of showing off vaporing from amalgams under certain conditions. And again, it depends a little bit on the individual because not everybody has the same susceptibilities. You know, some people you could feed them mercury and they're going to do a pretty good job of, you know, doing some things to minimize the damage internally. Other people are just not going to be as efficient. Not everybody is the same. You're basically looking for a biological dentist when you're removing amalgams. I don't know if you've heard that expression before, but there are a handful of biological dentists in town that do a great job at mercury removal. And if you need a referral, you just let me know. Now, another major toxin category are the glycol ethers. These are, again, a whole set of molecules, and they're quite toxic a lot because they are soluble in both water and organic solvents. So there's probably about 30 glycol ethers in numerous industrial applications, in particular as solvents in paint. They're also incorporated into adhesives, ink, varnishes, cosmetics, cleaning products, and products for mechanics and metalworking. And these particular compounds have been confirmed to be hemotoxic and bone marrow suppressing. By hemotoxic, what that really means is that they destroy blood cells and they prevent more red blood cells from being formed, basically. And so there have been animal studies that have shown mutations and gene problems and carcinogenicity in animals. So far, we don't have too many studies showing that in people, but it wouldn't surprise me if that doesn't eventually come out. There's a couple of particular glycol ethers that have showed influences on developmental toxicity and testicular toxicity, and fetal damage and female fertility issues have also been associated. And really, to avoid this toxin, and for most people, lots of cleaning products, especially the harsher cleaning products that people use in their house, have these compounds in them, like Windex, lemon fresh pine sol, that simple green all-purpose cleaner, Mop and Glow. You know, these are products that lots of people use in their houses, and they contain these fairly toxic compounds. You don't want to be using them in your house without a lot of ventilation. Now, another toxin that we don't, we hear a little bit about this, I think, but not nearly enough is radon. Radon's an odorless, tasteless radioactive gas that's produced from the decay of uranium in the ground, so in rocks and soil. And it can be found in homes, especially in basements and other areas in contact with the ground. And you don't know if it's in your home unless you test for it. And it is actually worth testing for because next to smoking, radon is the second most frequent cause of lung cancer. Now, in order to minimize radon, you have to seal floors and walls that are in contact with the earth. And often you might have to increase underfloor ventilation or overall ventilation to get the radon out of the house. In worst case scenario, you have to close the basement off from the rest of the house. Um, Radon can also be found in water. And if you suspect that it's, especially if you're in a place where you don't have city supplied water, you should have your water checked for radon. It can be removed through like aeration or activated carbon, actually. But this is a very prevalent problem in Alberta. This is the map here for the radon potential in Alberta. And you can kind of see on the top right there, it's showing the radon map like for the rest of Canada. And you can see that basically most of Alberta is like a big red zone. And mostly the reason is because of the kind of rock that we're sitting on. And so there's when radium in the soil and rock breaks down, you get this radioactive unstable gas, and it actually emits alpha particle radiation that is like very damaging to DNA. It's almost impossible for a body to repair that without introducing gene errors, and this is what actually can drive cancer formation. So radon is listed as a category 1 carcinogen. So it's absolutely known to cause cancer in humans. And as radon's inhaled in your lungs, it's primarily triggering the formation of lung cancer. So lung cancer is the #1 cause of cancer death in Canada, even in folks who have never smoked. So if you do smoke, it makes it even worse. So if you have radon in your house and then you smoke, it's not just like a 1 + 1 = 2. It's more like a 1 + 1 is equal to 17. So smokers are at a huge risk from radon, and so they should protect themselves if they're actively smoking to reduce their chances. Now, you're supposed to only get about 200 becquerel, that's the unit for radiation from radon, allowed in a house. It's like 200 becquerel. Some homes in Western Canada have radon as high as 10,000. That's like having 60,000 dental x-rays of radiation every year. You just do not want to have that. Now you can see them in Calgary here. This is a map showing this areas of radon in Calgary and surrounding areas and the ways in which radon enters houses. And you can see here that, depending on where in the city you are, you can have more or less, but there's still quite a bit. And especially in Cochrane, again, because of what they're sitting on, there's just more natural radon gas coming up through that community. 261 becquerel per cubic meter. That's more than the limit. So it's worth having it tested out. Now, our next major category of toxins are the fire retardants. And this is also not great. There's more than 75 types of brominated flame retardants used commercially, and they're applied to consumer products. So you find these fire retardants in electronic products, appliances, textiles like normal clothing, with clothing on your back right now, probably could potentially have been inundated with brominated flame retardants, like children's pajamas, mattresses, furniture, stuffed toys, pillows, cushions, plastic, rubber products, building insulation, like all the building materials. There are some flame retardants that are not allowed to be used in products or clothing intended for children that are more toxic, but at the end of the day, you're finding those in a lot of consumer products. And most people are surprised to know, like that you're going to find it like in an appliance. Like, it's crazy. They're coated on the inside of appliances so that you don't have spark fires from them. So it's interesting because I wonder, like, relatively speaking, I guess it doesn't take much to burn down a house. Actually, at the end of my block, a house burnt down 2 years ago, and it was a candle that was left burning in the house, and it just basically disintegrated the entire house. We left in the morning for a hike and came back by the afternoon. The house was gone. It's crazy. And there's lots of fire calls every day. Now, granted, I don't think we have nearly as many fire calls as when more people smoked all over the place and smoked in bed and stuff like that. At least I'm hoping so. I don't know. I have some firefighters in my patient database. I should ask them if it's actually technically gotten to be less, since we haven't had people smoking all the time. But in essence, when you put those flame retardants in products, they just eventually come out of the product. So they're like slowly released as that product is used or begins to break down. So foam cushions, as an example, they can contain 1 kilogram of flame retardant. So there's lots of these compounds that Canada doesn't use anymore. But like I said, they're difficult to get rid of. They're incredibly persistent. They've been found to contaminate the bodies of people and wildlife around the globe. Even polar bears have been shown to have fire retardant in them. There's high levels of fire retardants in breast milk. Animal studies where pregnant animals are exposed show problems with fetal brain development, neurobehavioral toxicity when your memory and learning are impaired, delays in sexual development. And many of the known health effects of these compounds are thought to stem from their ability to disrupt thyroid hormone balance. So basically, you're depressing levels of T3 and T4 thyroid hormones, and those are important to normal metabolism. So, in essence, especially if you get these in a small child, huge health risk to fetuses, infants, children, basically at the levels that are currently detected in North American women. So firefighters' bloodstreams show huge levels of these chemicals, and they suffer disproportionately high levels of testicular cancer, melanoma, brain cancer, and esophageal cancer. In fact, there's a University of Victoria report that actually published this data. In 2017 in San Francisco, female firefighters under the age of 50 were studied, and it was shown they had 6 times the US national average for breast cancer. So cancer is the leading cause of occupational injury and death in firefighters. And I think there was a 2018 study of BC workers' comp claims in firefighters, and it showed cancer caused more than 86% of firefighter fatalities. And there's 25,000 full-time firefighters in Canada and about 125,000 volunteers across the country. So this is a big risk, and you can't completely mitigate for it. You have to have, just incredible PPE, basically, and you can't 100% decrease that exposure. But of course, you can decrease your flame retardant exposure. So purchase furniture and mattresses that are made from organic materials where you can. You can actually get those things. They are more expensive a lot of the time, but that because they don't have big production runs. You don't have you don't have the IKEA of organic materials. You can get rid of products that include foam made before 2005. That year actually saw some changes in regulation. So some products are going to be less since then. Invest in a HEPA sealed vacuum cleaner. Again, it traps toxins when you use it. Sometimes using a broom to stir dust and accumulated toxins into your air. These particular flame retardants are high component in dust for whatever reason. A lot of these compounds end up in like dust and dander on the ground and outside. And so you have to find ways of cleaning it up without just spreading it around. Poultry and red meat can contain high levels of brominated flame retardants. It's just crazy. So if you have a chance, again, these are a couple of different ways of improving or decreasing your exposure and decreasing your risks from those exposures. Now, another major category of toxins are organophosphates. Originally, organophosphates were neurotoxic compounds that were produced for chemical warfare during World War II. And now we use them for herbicides and pesticides and insecticides because basically they target nervous systems of insects. And even though they're huge health and environmental concerns, agricultural use is still permitted. So we even use organophosphates as mosquito abatement in public spaces. And those compounds persist in soil. They can travel in the air when they're sprayed. So, obey the signs when they say they're spraying. And don't forget, we live in a community that's surrounded by non-organic grain farms, like all around Calgary. And that basically travels on the air. Acute toxic reactions to organophosphates usually are seen more in farmers or people who are spraying them. So they can get vision problems, dizziness, headache, tremor, respiratory and cardiac problems, and death. Long term, if you've experienced acute poisoning, you can actually have chronic effects in the nervous system that persist over your lifetime. And there's evidence of harm of being exposed to just low levels of pesticides. There's consistently higher prevalence of neurological or psychiatric symptoms in people who've been exposed long term. And it's more difficult to test this kind of toxin. A lot of these compounds are fat soluble, so it's very hard to perfectly test a body burden. You can't just take a water-based, blood sample and easily find it. There are urine tests for the metabolites of the main organophosphates. That's assuming that your body's doing a relatively good job at starting to turf them out. In a recent CDC study, they tested for 212 chemicals. So that's for the Center for Disease Control, sorry. And that included 44 pesticides. And basically, they found most of them in most people. In fact, DDT breakdown products were found in more than 85% of Americans. That chemical has not been widely used in America or Canada since the late 60s, early 70s. And it's so biopersistent that we still see it in people who were not even born at that time. There's a lot of link to adverse effects on brain development, behavior, and fertility. And in fact, I remember this one time I had a patient whose job as a young mother was to spray pesticides and insecticides in the orchards in BC. And this came out because she presented with a tremor. And she was a scrapbooker. She liked to scrapbook, but she couldn't scrapbook anymore because her hands shook so bad. And when she told me about her history and this came out, I was like, wow. And at that time, I actually didn't have any metabolite testing for these compounds. At that time, you could try to do a fat biopsy, but that's very difficult to do. The best studies actually will use fat samples because a lot of those compounds are fat soluble and they get stored in fat. And so it's one of the best places to look for them. They also get stored in the fat in your central nervous system, much harder to sample. But so we have to kind of use our ways and means to even test these things. And at the time we didn't have the test for pesticides, but we did some mitigation work, just like pulling those toxins out. And her tremor actually really radically decreased and she could scrapbook again. But it took a while. And she basically said that she had either sprayed it. I think maybe it was in her mother. Her mother sprayed it and then she sprayed it. I mean, they basically had pesticide spraying jobs and they would take the kids with them into the orchard while they were spraying because it wasn't considered to be a big deal. Like we didn't know all of those things that were going to happen as a consequence of that. It's absolutely astonishing, really. So, obviously, it's difficult to avoid these sometimes. You can minimize your exposure in your own yard. You can not spray stuff on your lawn. You can listen to the signs, like I said, that they're spraying in your neighborhood. Don't let your animals and children play on fields that have been sprayed until there's been some rain. Your best bet's to buy organic produce, especially where that produce is known to have high concentration of pesticides. And there are definitely produce that's really worth buying more organic. In fact, you can get the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15 published every year at the Environmental Working Group. And like as examples, strawberries and things like that. Are there organophosphates in dandelion suppressant? I'm not sure, but in Calgary, they're not spraying for dandelions anymore. I don't know what they use to spray on dandelions in Calgary, but I would just avoid all of it, for heaven's sakes. It's so toxic. I'm always astonished at what we do to our environment. This is a huge topic, obviously. Like we can't even. I'm just brushing the surface here, and so this is our last set of toxins I'm going to talk about, and this is particle pollution. So this can range from dust or mold or fungal particles to chemical compounds from fuel emissions. And the number one source of air pollution in most cities is automobile emissions. But the landscaping industry can account for up to 10% of air pollution, especially the gas leaf blower. It's like one of the worst offenders. It deposits about 30% of its raw gasoline back into the air, along with the dust and all the other particles. Crazy. There's countless studies on the effects of particle pollution on health. Common effects just to particles: wheezing, coughing, shortness of breath, lung tissue swelling. That can contribute to the development of heart and lung disease, asthma attacks, lung cancer. Calgary has one of the highest average indoor particle counts you can find because we have a combination of low humidity and a lot of not so open air in winter. So we recirculate our air, and it can make a lot of indoor air pollution, especially in some of the newer homes that are sealed up very well for heating purposes. They're like better sealing windows and all those other things that actually help heat and heat loss, but they're actually bad for air quality unless you have an air exchange. Molds can have a huge impact on health. In Alberta, most mold problems are due to improper bathroom and basement construction, or in substantially older homes that weren't built to those standards, and less to do with what could be termed damp. That's more common in a humid area. Problems in people from mold are often related to HLA-DR gene mutations. So like I said, it's susceptibility of an individual. So those gene mutations don't allow a person to properly identify the biotoxins from molds and the other like organisms in the air. What you're supposed to do is initiate an antibody response, coat the biotoxin in antibodies, and then the liver will eliminate it. But instead, if you can't do that, there's basically a kind of inflammatory storm. It goes all the way into cytokine storm that could continue to develop over time, especially if the exposure isn't recognized. And of course, people are very reticent to move out of their homes. But if you feel better when you're not in the house, especially if you go on vacation, you feel a lot better. That's a sign to consider looking at, is there possibly some problem in my home that I'm just not aware of? Obviously, you could try to test. You can have somebody measure air quality company, like an air quality company can do air sampling. Use a really great furnace filter, an MER 13 or higher. So those are the ones that tend to be more solid. And then they have those metal frames in front and behind them to hold them more stiff. Get rid of your gas-powered lawn equipment and just use an electrical one. Obviously, you can always decrease the pollution in general by carpooling, and check all your fuel burning furnaces and hot water heaters. Have them inspected every once in a while to make sure they're exhausting properly. And then monitor humidity levels. If you don't have good ventilation, or if you have somebody in your house that always takes the 20-minute like scalding hot shower and doesn't put the fan on, that can actually increase your risk for moldy environments. It's by itself, it's not going to be all of it, but you have to be careful about that. So I'm hoping you can kind of getting sense like that this is often a really hidden cause of health problems, and sometimes it's difficult to consider because we have a tendency to think that, quote unquote, they would have told us if there's a problem to pay attention to. Unfortunately, the they is really us, and your informed consumer choices are probably the biggest factor in decreasing risks from environmental toxins. And it requires extra time and work and money and awareness. And unfortunately, we're often seeing control and prevention measures only when there's so much evidence to show that there's issues that, quote unquote, they have to do something to create guidelines to force the risk down. So don't assume studies have been done to address the safety of any chemical, or in particular, any combination of chemicals. We don't do testing on combos. And like I said, combinations of chemicals can actually be substantially worse than individual chemicals. What has really been shown repeatedly is that humans just have a lot of hubris about the things they invent and then just set loose, amongst their peers. And sometimes we cannot totally mitigate it. So like I said, try and take steps and precautions. Research what you're buying. Look at the environmental working group guides. Where you can avoid chemicals in your home or on your body or in your food, try and do it. Clean with non-chemical products. Check your body care products in the databases. Try to eat organic food in season. And don't forget, a good diet with lots of unprocessed foods forms the basis for your ability to properly detoxify things. Minimize your use of plastics. Don't heat things in plastics. Try not to buy water in plastics. Exercise. Hit the sauna. The more you sweat, the more toxins you can remove from your body. Be careful of that if you're actually ill, because you want to make sure that you're also binding things from the inside out. And then consider having people inspect your home if you're suspicious of something, especially if you have chronic illness, for particulate and for molds and compounds like that. So I wanted to say, what we didn't talk about today is actually a lot. We didn't talk about geopathic stress. That's a whole category of things that can happen in houses and buildings. We didn't talk about underground water. We didn't talk about electromagnetic radiation in devices. We didn't talk a lot about water quality. We didn't talk about like the PFOA on nonstick coatings. Your own government thinks that nonstick coatings are fine, even though if you get a nonstick coating at high heat, in 3 to 5 minutes, it'll release 15 toxic gases and chemicals, including 2 carcinogens. And it's interesting, the Canadian government considers the PFOA on nonstick coatings harmful to the environment, but not to humans. And there's this huge gap between like observing things. Like, of course, you're not going to acutely get ill from using a frying pan, but you're sure going to get ill if you use that frying pan for 30 years, potentially, especially if you high heat it. We didn't talk about natural paints that you can use. We didn't talk about lighting problems, that are not biologically compatible. We didn't talk about noise. We didn't talk about vibration pollution. We didn't talk about grounding. We didn't even mention feng shui. But there's so many considerations in healthy homes. And for years, I actually gave a healthy home course where we talked about this in detail. And I think this year, I'm going to try and do a healthy home workshop in the fall for the first time in a while. So if you're interested in how to look at your lifestyle for toxins, let me know. That workshop's for you. Yeah, maybe there's some pieces that we're doomed about, Tim, but there's lots of things that we can control. It just really does require us to think clearly about what we're using and why we're using it. And, look kind of like a nerd and put on a respirator and put on protective equipment if you do have to use something that is toxic, and don't just tough it out the way we used to. And sometimes still do. I remember my grandparents cleaning things in gasoline like 50 years ago. So, but we're all going to learn, and we're all going to make awesome choices. I'm hoping. So, hopefully I didn't scare you too much. I know it does sound like a bit of doom and gloom, but it's something I've actually been relatively passionate about. I don't know if I can't remember when we talked about this on the last webinar, but I'm the person who had the Consumer Green Cleaner's Guide like when I was 19, and everybody just thought it was absolutely off my rocker. But I mean, I'd like to say like over the decades, I've been vindicated by a lot of these things, because I don't think those things, just knowing chemistry, you can just see, you wouldn't want to put those compounds anywhere near you. So don't do that. And we can talk about different ways of mitigating in lots more detail about how to evaluate if you're interested. Now, of course, we have tons more things planned for this year. I finally got the schedule out, and so these 6 are actually already up on the registration site. If you've had the chance to go and take a look at it, I can already see that some people have had the chance to go and take a look. So that's great. Our next one is going to be food allergies. It's going to be at the end of this month on the 30th. We're going to do essential oils and healing from genetically modified organism foods. We're going to talk about adaptogens in fall when everything starts to get more busy, probably, hopefully, and across the board. We're going to talk about anti-aging in October. That was a specific request. And we're going to talk about eczema. And then you can see on the right-hand side here, here's what we've already got planned for 2021. And so brain health and inflammation and sugar and happiness. So there, Tim, we can find some happiness, some sugar happiness or something. Hopefully that'll help it out a little tiny bit. So I'm so happy you guys had a chance to come and join me today. I hope it wasn't all doom and gloom. I know there's lots of things that you can do. And if you have questions about things, feel free to contact me. You know where to find me, hopefully. And I will see you in the next month or so for the next webinar. Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.